This is part of my rough draft for Sunday sermon series where I walk through my current state of my sermon. As some of you know, I've had a busy week. I've got a wedding today, so I got to wear a suit. But I'm just going to walk through my draft of my sermon so far. And those of you who also come here to Living Stones on Sunday, things may change. So there's fair warning to you. Last week I began with this question: how could a good God allow a world with this much suffering? And this is something I hear from people on a fairly regular basis. Also implicit in this, people will often say things like, we could do a better job at running this world than God. I think that the not necessarily pushback, but the question I often have for people who make that statement is, well, aren't we running the world? And when we start these wars, isn't it us that starts them? And so this idea of, is God running the world or are we running the world, that in and of itself seems to be a very interesting question, especially for people who don't have faith. And last week I talked about this Spectator article, Does Aid Do More Harm Than Good?, following the scandal at Oxfam over revelations that they've covered up situations in the Haiti earthquake and other places in Africa where some of their aid workers were exchanging food for sex with young girls. And last week we looked at the covenant of Noah, and I believe the thesis statement of the Bible, what the story of the Bible is about, is that God rescues the world from us, which is a difficult statement for those of us who don't believe in God, because then it's just a fairy tale. Or it's a difficult statement for those of us who may or may not believe in God but have issues with the God of the Bible. And we may very well have issues and say, well, we don't want to be rescued from, we don't want you to rescue us from ourselves. We'd like you to leave us alone. And I think that is essentially a definition of what hell is, where God finally says to his creation, I won't bother you anymore. And so some of you might say, well, that's exactly what I want. And so I'd say, good, then you get what you want. I don't recommend it, but I understand how people say that. And the story begins, of course, with the story, and this is the Genesis 1 representation, the story of heaven and earth. And then in Genesis 2, there's the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden is really a royal garden. It's the palace garden of the great king. And there's no separation in the beginning of the story between heaven and earth. Heaven and earth are one. And those of you who know the end of the story in the book of Revelation, heaven and earth get reunited. And if you look at Jesus' Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus' prayer, in fact, asks for the unification of heaven and earth. But what happens in the rebellion is that the man and the woman basically say to the God, we want to run the earth our own way. And this would be shocking for, let's say, Israelites who are accustomed to Nebuchadnezzar and his hanging garden. If the gardeners of the hanging garden came to Nebuchadnezzar and said, we'd like to take the garden in our own direction, they wouldn't last 10 minutes. Nebuchadnezzar would call the butcher and off with their heads. And that's pretty much how every ancient Near East potentate would act, and pretty much how most great men in the history of the world act. The definition of great men and leadership in this world is that it's my way or your death. And so this is quite dramatic in Genesis 3, where God exiles them from the garden, and God separates him from their presence, but in a sense he leaves the earth to them. And so what happens, according to the book of Genesis, is that in the first family there's the first murder, and then the children of the first family multiply, but the earth becomes full of bloodshed, and God regrets having made the world and humanity, and so decides to drown it, to flush it, if you were. But he picks the best man in the world, Noah, and he saves him, and he tells him to build an ark. And then we get this first sighting of this thing that is called a covenant. And the sign of the covenant is a rainbow. And so basically what the rainbow means is that the firmament, this vaulted ceiling of heaven and earth, God will maintain the vault. He will not send the waters above crashing in and the waters below emerging up so that the earth is destroyed because of the violence of humanity. But what he does then is enter into a covenant. And you see this frequently in the Hebrew scriptures, that covenants usually have parties, and the parties of the covenant of Noah is God on one hand and humanity as stewards and all living things that draw breath on the other. These were the group that he saved in the ark, and these were the group that he told to be fruitful and multiply again on the earth, and these are the two parties of the covenant. And the agreement basically goes like this, that God will maintain the firmament if the people stop killing each other and honor the death of the animals. At this point, the animals are rightly given by God to the people to eat, all animals, not just clean. And in the Noah passage, as we talked about last week, there's clean and unclean, but they must not eat it with blood in it, because the blood symbolizes the life, and they should respect that the life of the animal belongs to God and human beings are merely stewards of it. And the sign of the covenant is, in fact, the rainbow. So every time water starts falling from the heavens, humanity might get concerned that God's going to flood them and wash them out. But the covenant says, no, I'm not going to destroy the whole earth with a flood anymore. But your side of this agreement is, in fact, to stop shedding, to honor the animals in an appropriate way, and to honor my image in each other by not killing one another. Well, what you find at the end of the book of, what you find as continues in the story of Noah, that after Noah, humanity pretty much picks up where it leaves off, and they build the Tower of Babel because they hope to be able to get up to heaven to take control of the earth, and so God confuses their language. But here's God's problem. What to do with a group of people with whom that can't keep their word? How do you make an agreement? Why do you establish a covenant with people who don't follow through, who don't keep up their end of the stick? And when it comes, at least to the covenant of Noah, humanity has a moral credit score of 0. We did not stop killing each other. We don't honor the life that the animals have, and we simply continued to dominate the world and do with it as we see fit. And sometimes we do better things or worse things with it. But in terms of our ability to keep our agreement with God, we have none. And now people will say, well, Pastor, I'm a very reliable person and I keep my agreements. And there are so many religions in the world and so many different rules. And, how are we supposed to know what God wants? Well, actually, Jesus deals with this within his own cultural framework at one point. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees and the Pharisees got together. One of the interesting things about Jesus is that it was constantly sparring with the people around him. And they couldn't seem to overcome him, and this raised their annoyance with him, and so they continued to try to test him with the questions that were pertinent to their time. And so one of them comes, an expert of the law, to test him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophet hangs on these 2 commandments." Now, one of the things that you might notice about this is that this isn't terribly inventive of Jesus. This answer had been around for a long time in Judaism, and you might even notice that this answer isn't that different from what you'll find in other religious traditions. The golden rule, before Jesus spoke it, and it's recorded in the New Testament, you will find it in the Old Testament. You will find it, you'll find versions of it in many, many other religions in the world. And so C.S. Lewis, at the end of his book, The Abolition of Man, has a table that he calls the Tao. And this, he basically says, this moral law is surprisingly uniform across cultures. And so here Jesus says, well, here's the moral law. Can you keep it? Well, do you love God? Now, Love, meaning, especially in covenantal terms, give him the respect he deserves, give him what you owe him. And in most religions, it boils down to worship. And worship meaning that we appear before God ceremonially, symbolically. We offer our gifts to God. We declare the parts of our side that we had let down. In the Christian tradition, this means confession of our sins, and we praise the God verbally. And so a lot of people will say, well, why should I go to church? Well, this is part of loving God, and it shouldn't be totally foreign to us. If you went to a public school, you probably were used to saying the Pledge of Allegiance of the flag. You pay your taxes. This is, in a sense, the way you love your state, and you are loyal to your state. Well, in the ancient world, and this is carried forward in religions today, part of the way that you love God is you learn to respect the God, and you show up ceremonially for the God as a person should do, and you pledge your allegiance to the God, and you confess the ways that you failed your God. Now maybe you don't believe in God, and so okay, well, it's interesting that I find many people, even who don't believe in God, have this sense of honor and respect that maybe they want to pledge towards nature or towards fellow humanity or towards something like this, but this basic impulse persists. And in a sense, the clearest sign that you don't have a relationship with a God is if you don't quite know how to worship, don't quite know how to pledge allegiance, don't quite know how to show up and show respect. And as I said, I think these basic impulses and these basic formats are transcultural, and each specific religion and each specific culture learns to do them in their own fashion. But the basic impulse of loving God is I think, nearly universal. It seems almost baked into us. And then it gets even more baked when we say, well, you should love your neighbor as yourself. And especially in the West, with the results of Christendom, people will all say, well, yeah, love is it, and love is my religion. What is what people owe to each other? Love is what we respect in each other. And so then the question is, do you love your neighbor? Do you love your neighbor to their satisfaction? You say, well, that certainly can't be the criteria by which my loving my neighbor is. Well, if you don't have a God, then suddenly the question is, well, if you love your neighbor to your own satisfaction, then that's rather convenient and self-serving. Certainly you should love your neighbor to the satisfaction of someone else. And if you have a God, the God is in fact the judge of that. So to whose satisfaction do you love your neighbor? A second test, I would say, is, do you keep even the standards you demand of them? There's a little pastor, there's all these little stock pastor stories that pastors use, and one of them is, imagine that there's a tape recorder around your neck, and every time you maybe it's a cell phone in your pocket. Now we got to update these pastor stories. There's a cell phone in your pocket, and every time you express a standard that someone should be held to. Maybe that means keeping up their yard, or maybe that means how they drive, or maybe that means what they should do with their money, or what they should do with their body, or how they should treat their own body, or how they should treat the animals, or something like that. Imagine that every time you express a standard to someone else, that your cell phone kind of, Siri or Google Voice or whoever kind of clicks on, notices that you're expressing a standard, and records it. And at the end of your life, someone hauls you into a judgment room and says, okay, we're going to play back the standard that you have held the world to, and we're going to judge your life against that standard. How would you hold up? Now, this is where we get into the trickiness of self-judgment. How would I hold up? And we're all suspicious of one another, and we know that we're biased towards ourselves, and so then we begin to recognize that actually the people who know themselves the least often show themselves to be less self-critical. And often the people who show themselves to know themselves better are more self-critical. And so again, we have this need for someone else to hold us accountable. And In democratic societies, we imagine that the community does this, and that community is then expressed through a judge who is elected or a government who is elected. And so what do we do that goes beyond well-meaning? Now, in a sense, the story of God's redemptive act through Noah seems to be a failure. And so in Genesis 12, God changes course. And he selects a man named Abram. And he tells Abram to go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And so Abram goes. So Abram, as the Lord had told him, Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had acquired, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan until they arrived there. Now what's interesting is why the inclusion of Lot, and why the naming of Lot. Now, as you'll find out soon, that Abram and Sarai have no children. So why would they bring Lot, his nephew? Well, anyone in the Near East would know, well, he's bringing his nephew because his nephew is his heir apparent, because everybody needs an heir, because in the ancient world, you don't live into the future as we imagine now through somehow we're going to conquer death and keep ourselves biologically alive. You live into the future through your children and through your heirs, and it's through your heirs that your thoughts, your ideas, the things that value you. And so fathers, children are supposed to respect their fathers, assume their father's belief systems. They inherit their father's property. And so in a sense, the parents live on through their children. But Abram and Sarah have no children. And so Lot is the child that they've never had. And so God comes to Abram and says, I'm going to fulfill my promises to you. And then God doesn't seem to. God approaches Abram at the age of 75 and says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And he says, well, Abram in the back of his mind says, okay, Lot will be my heir. And, Sarah isn't having any children, and no one expects Sarah to have any children. Abram's 75 and she's 65. This is a bit long in the tooth, and she's not about to have any more children, and so he's thinking Lot. And what the story of Abram actually is, his adventures are him trying to prime the pump on this promise that God gives him. But all of his priming the pump exercises are really expressions of Abram's distrust for him. And so Abram's adventures in priming the blessings pump go on and on. Abram's wife is beyond childbearing years, and this is symbolic for his culture of having no future. And so that's why he's got Lot. You beat death through your children, and this is in fact very Darwinian. But trials come. There's a famine, which again in the communication of the Bible is symbolic for an uncertain future in the land. And so he flees to Egypt, and Egypt is in the Bible the great symbol of empire. And he risks his wife Sarai because he's afraid. And this begins the very interesting and long rivalry between God and empire throughout the Bible as it unfolds. And God intervenes with a dream and threatens Pharaoh, and Abram leaves with stuff, with riches, but no reputation, which is very interesting, which is something that, another theme that picks up in empire as we go through the Bible. And then in kind of the second story, Abram and Lot's men quarrel, and they are symbolically rich. And so God, in fact, has been blessing them, because in the old covenant, wealth is a symbol of blessing, and their hordes can't get along, so they separate. And then, Lot is so rich he gets kidnapped, and Abram has to rescue Lot. But, in the back of Abram's mind, he's probably still thinking, well, maybe Lot, but now Lot's far off, and Lot's kind of establishing his own house, and so where's this going to go? And then there's a strange story in the book of Genesis where God cuts a covenant with Abraham, and in in the language in the language of the Hebrew scriptures, that's the word that they use. They use cut, and you have this story of these animals that are cut in half. And generally speaking, you would cut the animals in half, and both sides would walk between the animals. And in a sense, it would be saying symbolically, this is a lot more than signing a contract. Symbolically, if I break my side of the covenant, then I should be as one of these animals, that I will be cut in half. And, it makes me think of, the Godfather movie with Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes. The Sicilian message of the fish wrapped in a suit. And so then when the sun set, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appears and passes between the visions, between the pieces. And this is, in a sense, God saying to Abraham, reiterating what he had said in chapter 12, now look, I'm telling you, I'm going to keep my promise to you. And if I fail to keep my promise, I alone will pay the price of the failed relationship. Now this is never done, because we all know how to establish justice in the world. Trust but verify. And if fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. This is how the world works. And here God walks through and says, I will pay the price. And this is amazing too, because in a sense with this covenant, God hasn't asked anything much of Abram yet. Leave your country. He's essentially saying, begin to trust me. And what belief is trust in action. That's really what belief is. And so God says, I'm this determined to fulfill my promise through you. But Abram doesn't believe. And so the priming of the pump continues. Sarai doesn't have a child yet, and so she has a bright idea. She says, take Hagar and sleep with my maidservant. This is a common way. So one way to, if you don't have any children, to make a way around it is to adopt a nephew. Well, things with Lot haven't worked out so well. So another way is to sleep with one of your wife's maidservants, because a slave doesn't have the status of a person. So anything that slave produces belongs to you. So you can take this son and make him your own. And so Abram does this, but this doesn't turn out so well. And in fact, what happens here is that Hagar has the child, and Hagar starts to nag Sarah. And yes, she's a slave. She has no status, but she's still a human being, and she still uses her mouth. And she, in a sense, is using the leverage of her son to gain status over her mistress. And so Sarah says basically, oh, I know what to do with you. You're dead. And so demands of Abram. First, she demanded that he sleep with her, and Abram probably thought, well. And second, he demands that they send her out into exile and death. And now Abram has a problem with this, and God intervenes. And we won't go into that whole story, but there it is. Now we get to chapter 17, and Abram's 99 years old. God has been stringing this poor guy along for 24 years. And the Lord appeared to him. I am the Lord, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between you and me, and will greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, which is what you're supposed to do. And God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You'll be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram, but your name will be Abraham, for I've made you the father of nations. And I'll establish my covenant with you. And goes on about your offspring and your flesh, and circumcision will be the sign. So God shows up again and says, well, my deal's still on, and here circumcision is going to be the sign. And so that's what you should practice. And so the covenant with Abram gets clarified. The parties are God and Abraham and his descendants, and the agreements are God will give descendants in the land and blessing and all of those things. And Abram's part, well, that's a little fuzzy. Do the right thing. Walk before me, be loyal to me. But really the main thing here is trust, and trust is played out behavior. Trust played out in behavior is what we call belief. And the sign of this will be circumcision, and also the name change of Abram. But Abram's always had trouble trusting, and Abram's got a point here because he says, "Hey, look, you've been stringing me along for 24 years, and we don't live that long, and that's a long time. And so I've been working my side of this to try to make these blessings happen, and God keeps coming to him and saying, no, it's not going to be Lot. No, it's not going to be Ishmael." And so when Abram falls face down, he laughs, and of course, in the next story, chapter 18, it's very famous because Sarah will laugh, but Abram laughed first. He really does. Here he laughs to himself because he doesn't believe. He doesn't believe God. And the reason he doesn't believe God is biological, because he says, will a son be born to a man of 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abram said to God, "If only Ishmael might be your blessing, why don't you adopt all of the ways that I've tried to getting around believing you? Adopt that for me, please." And God says, no, I am going to fulfill my promise. Remember cutting the animals in half? I am going to fulfill my promise. Ishmael, he'll be fine. He'll be fruitful and multiply. In a sense, he goes back into the broader pot of Noah's covenant and Noah's children. But my deal with Abram here, this is special. And so Abram doubles down, and he continues to follow, even after all of this, even after he left, even though he's got his doubts. So he takes Ishmael, and his whole house is circumcised. But we can begin to see a pattern developing. God makes promises with people who can't keep them, and God asks the people who can't keep the real promises in practice, trust or belief, to believe in them symbolically, to in a sense, fake it till you make it, show good faith. And the covenant signs, well, the rainbow is the covenant sign. And in a sense, the rainbow, which was a symbol of God's faithfulness, in a sense becomes a reminder of us who are faithless. And circumcision is now a covenant sign, and it's kind of the counterpart to the woman's curse. Now, just jumping ahead, I'm not going to go into this, but in Christianity, there's a New Covenant translation that Christians become adopted children of Abraham through the blood of Christ, and circumcision gets replaced with baptism, and the land which is promised for Abram begins expanded in the New Testament, in fact, to the entire earth. The meek will inherit the earth, and blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But what's critical here is that Abraham laughs. Abraham doesn't believe. But at the same time, while he's got his doubts, he keeps trying to keep formal covenant. He's working it. The kingdom has not come. It has not arrived. But he's face down, and even while he's worshiping, he's laughing to himself because he can hardly keep a straight face, because he can hardly maintain his beliefs. And Sarah won't be able to in the next chapter. But he waits in that mode of saying, I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to love God the best I can. I'm going to love the neighbor the best I can. And so I am going to, my life is going to be marked by faith, not by sight. And even though you keep coming to me, God, and making promises to me, and even though I don't see them panning out, I'm not giving up. I'm holding fast. And this then, I think, is why Abraham later in the book of Hebrews is seen as a hero of faith, in a sense, almost because he laughs. And so here we are. We wait on the covenant, and some of us try to keep the covenant signs, and we might be sometimes going through the motions. But in those moments, we laugh, in a sense, laughing and giving up, laughing with our face to the ground is in worship is, in a sense, staying right there in that tension, and staying right there in faith, and staying right there and saying, I have my doubts. I don't know. I'm really struggling here because the promises do not seem to be fulfilled. How can I continue to believe? But I will remain face down in worship, even as I laugh, and I will keep faithful. I will try to keep my side of the covenant. Now, God keeps his side. this is the point of walking through the halved animals. Abram is waiting for a son. God sends his son, and he is brutalized and murdered by empire, by us, our rivalry with God. And God does our side for us. And that is, in a sense, what we see is that in the crucifixion of Jesus, it is God walking through the halved animals. It is God paying the price for our covenant unfaithfulness. And so then the question is, we're on our face laughing. And if you're trying to love the Lord your God through worship, and you're still at worship, and you've got your doubts, or you're struggling to find a church, or you're struggling to believe, or your prayers sound like, God, if there's anyone listening, that's in a sense Abram falling face down and laughing. But then the question is, will we start to believe? And maybe we're that position, and we don't believe yet, or we want to believe. And so then the question is, will we start to believe? And what kind of actions do we need to take to start to believe? And will we be laughing to ourselves while we're doing this because it seems crazy and it seems like lunacy? Will we start to even try to keep covenant? Will we try to love God and keep loving God in symbolic ways? Will we try to love our neighbor? And obviously, we can get far more concrete in loving our neighbor. We can get concrete in loving God too, in a sense. If you go to church and you confess your sins, and you praise or worship God, and you give your offerings, that's a concrete way of loving God. And will we find concrete ways of loving our neighbor, of faithfulness and generosity in our relationships? And again, the point here is not that you do these things because these things somehow give you status with God. The point here is that God has given his promises. And I always end you might notice already that I often end my sermons with misery, deliverance, gratitude, that we are not able to keep our side of the covenant. God has, in fact, through Jesus, walked through the halved animals. And so that, in a sense, God is the rescuer. But the question is, how will we respond? Because in many ways, Abram's response to God doesn't save him from anything. The kinds of things that Abram does, they might participate in the land. Well, Lot is still out there and Ishmael's still out there, but God says, I'm going to give you Isaac. And of course, the climax of the story will be God telling Abram to sacrifice his son. And then Abram following through, but God stopping him at the last minute. And all of this comes together in the story of Jesus. And so then the question is, well, if you believe that, in fact, God has already done this, how must we then work? And then the real questions are, how does our work then actually participate? And that's where covenant is interesting, because covenant says, in a sense, that this is something that God has done, is doing, and will do. He does the heavy lifting. But in a sense, like a father does to his son, if the father is, let's say, working on the car and the son comes along and says, I want to help, it's to the father and the son's glory that the son gets to participate. And that is, in a sense, what we do. And so then the question is, even if we're laughing like Abraham, even if we're on our face laughing, we're doing worship, but we hardly believe what we're doing, and there's pieces of our heart that says, God's never going to come through. We will be lost. We will be cut off. I'll never have a son. It'll never come to pass. Yet I will worship still. Yet I will love my neighbor as I love myself. Yet I will do this even if everything fails. And at that moment, we begin to understand what faith is.